The candles flicker against the stone walls of Whitehall Palace, casting long shadows over a man who has the power to reshape a kingdom. Henry VIII stands alone before a towering crucifix, not in defiance, but in devotion. No rage, no rebellion, no desperate fight against Rome. Instead, he bows his head, fingers pressed together in prayer. On this night, there is no thunderous break from the Catholic Church, because the decision that would fracture Christendom never happens. One choice, a single moment of restraint, dissolves the storm before it begins. There is no divorce crisis, no shattering of monasteries, no Church of England. And in that silence, history takes a completely different path. If Henry VIII never broke with Rome, England would remain Catholic, Europe would shift, and every familiar Tudor destiny would unravel. But why doesn't he rebel? What halts the creation of an entire new religion? Perhaps Queen Catherine of Aragon delivers a healthy son, ending Henry's desperation for an heir. Perhaps the king accepts the Pope's authority and abandons the idea of annulment. Or maybe Cardinal Wolsey, master diplomat, pulls off one final miracle that keeps king and pope aligned. In this alternate timeline, we will step into a Tudor world that almost existed, one where the foundations of England, from its monarchy to its very soul, change forever. We'll explore how the succession shifts, how politics and rebellion evolve, how Elizabeth I's fate transforms, and how England's identity, religious, cultural, and global, becomes something entirely different. To understand how England stays Catholic, we must first understand the desperation, fear, and ambition driving Henry VIII toward the historic break that never happens in this timeline. In real history, Henry's motives were a turbulent mix of politics, theology, and personal obsession. At the heart of everything lay a singular fear: the Tudor dynasty would collapse without a male heir. Catherine of Aragon had given him children, but only one survived, Princess Mary. Every miscarriage, every stillborn child, was a reminder that the Tudor line, barely 50 years old, could fall apart the moment Henry died. As the years passed, Henry's frustration deepened. Theologically, he convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was cursed, that her inability to give him a son was divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. Desperate for a solution, he turned to Cardinal Wolsey, Europe's greatest diplomat, to negotiate an annulment with Rome. But Wolsey failed. The Pope, trapped politically between Charles V and European politics, could not grant Henry what he demanded. That failure opened the door to a new circle of advisors: Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Cranmer, and a rising tide of Protestant thinkers who urged Henry to challenge the Pope directly. Their influence empowered Parliament, ignited the English Reformation, and ultimately shattered centuries of Catholic unity. But not in this timeline. The divergence, we choose the most historically plausible alternate event. Catherine of Aragon finally gives Henry a healthy, living son. This single moment neutralizes every fuse leading to the Reformation. Suddenly, there is no annulment crisis. Henry has no reason to challenge the Pope. And Boleyn remains a charismatic court figure, not a queen. Cardinal Wolsey's power stabilizes instead of collapsing. Protestant advisors lose their influence. Parliament remains politically weak and overshadowed by royal and clerical authority. Immediate ripple effects: Rome keeps a firm spiritual grip on England. The Pilgrimage of Grace, rooted in outrage against Henry's religious reforms, never happens. Wolsey's moderate church reforms create a more centralized but deeply Catholic Tudor monarchy. Catherine remains queen. Mary remains heir presumptive until the long-awaited prince grows strong. History is already off its rails. With Henry VIII remaining loyal to Rome, the spiritual and cultural landscape of England evolves into a world almost unrecognizable compared to our timeline. The English Reformation never ignites, and the kingdom continues along a path of deep, uninterrupted Catholic tradition. The great monasteries, Glastonbury, Fountains Abbey, Tintern, remain towering engines of wealth, learning, and charity. Instead of being dismantled and sold to nobles for quick profit, their estates stay intact. These religious houses continue to dominate the countryside with their farms, hospitals, libraries, and guest houses. Social welfare remains closely tied to the church. The poor are fed by monks, the sick treated in monastic infirmaries, and the elderly sheltered in religious communities. Without the dissolution, there is no massive transfer of land to the nobility, and the economic foundations of the church remain powerful and stable. This has profound political consequences. With no surge of land-rich nobles, the aristocracy remains influential but never becomes as politically assertive as it did after the Reformation. Parliament, lacking the legislative empowerment it gained when Henry used it to justify the break with Rome, remains a secondary institution, summoned occasionally, but never central to national policy. The clergy retain their traditional authority in taxation, law, and diplomacy, forming a governing partnership with the crown that keeps England firmly rooted in medieval political structures. Culturally, the country develops in a dramatically different direction. Latin remains the language of worship. Cathedrals stay richly decorated with stained glass, intricate carvings, and sacred relics. The waves of Protestant iconoclasm that destroyed shrines and artwork never occur. Oxford and Cambridge remain institutions shaped heavily by the Church, preserving scholastic traditions and resisting the intellectual currents of Protestant Europe. Art, music, and architecture maintain a deeply Catholic aesthetic, filled with ceremony, grandeur, and devotion. Internationally, England stands firmly within the Catholic power bloc led by the Habsburgs. Relations with Spain strengthen rather than deteriorate. Diplomacy with the Pope remains harmonious. Henry avoids excommunication entirely, allowing England to benefit from marriage alliances, shared military interests, and smoother communication with Catholic Europe. In this alternate world, England's religious identity remains unified, traditional, and unmistakably Catholic, setting the stage for a radically different Tudor future. In a world where Henry VIII never breaks from Rome, and Boleyn's fate shifts dramatically. Instead of becoming the catalyst for a religious revolution, she remains what she originally was, a captivating, ambitious, and politically astute court lady. Her charm, wit, and sophistication still draw Henry's attention, but without the urgency of producing a male heir, there is no justification to elevate her to queenship, and likely becomes a long-term mistress, important, influential, but never crowned. Because she never becomes queen, she never becomes dangerous. There is no charge of treason, no accusations of adultery, and no execution on Tower Green. The darker chapter of her story simply never unfolds. The Boleyn family, without the meteoric rise that came from Anne's queenship, remains respected but modest, tied to diplomacy, culture, and continental connections rather than national power. This change has massive political consequences. The Protestant faction that historically gathered around and never gains momentum. Thomas Cromwell, whose rise depended on Henry's need to dismantle the Church's authority, may remain a minor administrative figure rather than the architect of the Reformation. Without Anne's influence, there is no ideological shift toward Protestantism at court and no radical restructuring of England's political machinery. If Elizabeth is still born, a possibility, given Henry's attraction to and she arrives into the world as an illegitimate child. Yet illegitimacy in a Catholic monarchy does not doom her future. She would still be raised with dignity, perhaps even sent abroad to a French or Burgundian court to be polished as a noblewoman. This ties naturally into the viral comment theorizing that Elizabeth would be married off into European royalty, not positioned for an English throne she no longer needs to claim. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon stands unchallenged. With a surviving son, her position is unshakable, her dignity untouched, and her marriage secure. There is no public humiliation, no divorce trial, no forced exile. She remains the respected Catholic queen of a stable dynasty, something she always longed for. In this alternate timeline, the entire fate of England pivots around a single birth. Catherine of Aragon successfully delivers a healthy son. This child, likely named Henry or Edward, reshapes the destiny of every Tudor and rewrites the political architecture of Europe. His presence stabilizes the monarchy instantly. Henry VIII no longer lives in fear of dynastic collapse, and the desperate search for a male heir that fueled the break with Rome never occurs. The succession becomes not a battlefield of religion and legitimacy, but a clean and orderly Catholic line. Prince Henry grows up as the unquestioned heir to the Tudor throne, raised under the watchful eye of Cardinal Wolsey and a court steeped in Catholic orthodoxy. Mary, Catherine's surviving daughter, remains cherished as the second in line. With the stain of illegitimacy erased from her life, she grows into a confident, respected Catholic princess. Without the psychological scars of displacement, humiliation, and political warfare, Mary never develops the bitterness or defensive cruelty that marked her reign in our history. Instead of becoming the monarch who launches harsh persecution campaigns, she likely becomes a valuable diplomatic bride, married into the Habsburgs or another major Catholic house, strengthening England's continental alliances. Elizabeth's fate changes most dramatically of all. If she is still born in this timeline, she enters a world where her path is predetermined by her birth status. As the illegitimate daughter of a royal mistress, she possesses intelligence, charm, and refinement, but she has no political future in England. Instead, she becomes a noblewoman of rare talent, likely married to a French, Burgundian, or imperial noble. Raised abroad or partially at court, she becomes a diplomatic link between England and Europe, admired for her education and charisma. Yet she never ascends to the throne, never crafts an English golden age, never becomes Gloriana. The sweeping cultural explosion of art, exploration, and literature tied to her reign simply never materializes. If Catherine's son survives into adulthood, he becomes a deeply Catholic king. Guided in childhood by Wolsey, and later by conservative nobles, he inherits a nation firmly integrated into Catholic Europe. He never initiates Protestant reforms, never dismantles the monasteries, and never sets England on a course toward religious conflict. His reign would more closely resemble that of a Catholic Habsburg prince than the historically Protestant lineage of Edward VI. With a stable male heir, a respected queen, and daughters positioned advantageously in Europe, the Tudor succession becomes one of continuity rather than chaos. The crown moves smoothly from Henry VIII to his Catholic son, and England remains a fully Catholic nation, not just in law, but in identity, politics, and culture. With England remaining Catholic and firmly tied to Rome, its entire position within European politics transforms. The key to this new geopolitical reality is Catherine of Aragon herself. As the aunt of Emperor Charles V, she anchors England directly into the Habsburg power network. Instead of drifting away from Spain after the divorce crisis, England becomes an unshakable ally. Diplomatic ties strengthen, military cooperation deepens, and the English crown effectively joins the greatest Catholic superbloc of the 16th century. This shift dramatically alters the balance of power. The Habsburg Empire, already controlling Spain, Austria, Burgundy, the Netherlands, and huge swathes of Italy, gains England as a committed partner. Together, they form a coalition capable of dominating the continent. In this alternate world, England might even contribute troops or naval support in Habsburg conflicts against France, further intensifying the ancient rivalry between the two kingdoms. France, surrounded by Catholic powers, becomes England's natural enemy. The rivalry that historically simmered now erupts on multiple fronts. England may play a role in suppressing early French Protestant movements, aiding attempts to crush the Huguenots before they gain momentum. When the French Wars of Religion eventually emerge, England could intervene, this time not as a Protestant supporter but as a Catholic ally assisting the Crown of France. Ironically, the two old rivals might find themselves clashing not over territory, but over how to maintain Catholic dominance. The papacy, seeing England remain loyal, treats the Tudors as valued allies rather than rebellious heretics. There are no threats of interdict or excommunication, no diplomatic freezes, no theological warfare. England becomes a model Catholic kingdom whose loyalty strengthens papal prestige. Even Scotland, lacking the religious tension created by England's Protestant shift, stays Catholic far longer. Without a Protestant England funding rebellions or spreading reformist ideology, Scotland's political landscape remains much closer to Rome. Ireland, too, changes dramatically. The violent religious conflicts of later centuries, rooted in imposed Protestant rule, never develop with the same intensity. Plantation policies are delayed or perhaps never executed, because England has no ideological motive to transform Ireland's religious identity. Gaelic lords retain more autonomy, and Catholicism remains the shared foundation of both islands rather than a source of division. Overall, Europe becomes a continent with fewer fractures, but sharper rivalries. England does not stand apart from the Catholic world. It becomes one of its pillars, reshaping wars, alliances, and the very map of European power. The absence of Elizabeth I erases one of the most transformative eras in English history. Without her rise to the throne, England never experiences the burst of creativity, ambition, and confidence that defined the Golden Age. The cultural and political forces that shaped Shakespeare, the great explorers, and the early foundations of empires simply never materialize. The England of this timeline does not become the England of Shakespearean theaters, daring sea captains, or Protestant nationhood. Shakespeare may still write, but without the patronage of a Protestant, culturally ambitious monarch, his career would likely remain tied to Catholic court tastes, focusing on religious drama or classical themes rather than the sweeping human stories that define the Elizabethan stage. Sir Francis Drake's voyages, born from Protestant defiance of Spain and dreams of naval glory, never occur. There is no ideological push to challenge Catholic superpowers abroad, no appetite for global plunder, and no creation of a Protestant maritime identity. Instead of building a navy to confront Spain, England maintains its alliance with the Habsburgs. The Spanish Armada never sails, or, in an ironic twist, England might even support Spain diplomatically or logistically. England does not challenge Spanish authority in the Atlantic. Colonization begins later, if it begins at all. The voyages that seeded English America vanish from the timeline. Early English explorers, without political backing or Protestant zeal, have no stage on which to act. If England eventually turns outward, it may find itself competing with Portugal's maritime empire rather than Spain's, or it may enter the global race far too late to secure meaningful territory. Culturally, the nation grows more slowly. Without a Protestant push for widespread Bible reading, literacy expansion is limited. Printing remains dominated by Latin texts and Catholic theology rather than vernacular literature. Intellectual exchange becomes narrower and more scholastic, focused on medieval traditions preserved by the Church. Scientific progress, which in real history flourished under the more open intellectual climate of the Reformation, develops at a slower pace. England becomes a nation of stability rather than innovation, deeply Catholic, inward-looking, culturally conservative, and politically aligned with Europe's old order. The energy, exploration, and artistic rebirth of the Elizabethan age fade into a history that never happens. In the long sweep of global history, England's decision to remain Catholic reshapes the world far beyond its shores. The most dramatic change comes in the realm of empire. Without the naval rivalry against Spain that fueled early English exploration, England's overseas ambitions emerge slowly and cautiously. Instead of racing across the Atlantic, the Crown focuses on consolidating nearby territories, tightening control over Ireland, or securing small Atlantic islands like the Azores or Madeira if the opportunity arises. With no open hostility towards Spain, the great push into North America is delayed by decades, perhaps even a century. France and Spain retain dominance over the New World far longer, shaping its languages, cultures, and borders without early English interference. Within England, religion remains firmly Catholic. The Church dominates spiritual life, law, education, and political authority. Without the Reformation, there is no splintering into Anglicanism, Puritanism, or dissenting sections. The result is a more unified yet less flexible religious landscape, conformist, conservative, and deeply tied to papal authority. But while dissent is less tolerated, the nation is spared the violent oscillation between Protestant and Catholic regimes that devastated real Tudor England. Stability replaces chaos. Politically, the Tudor monarchy remains strong and centralized. Parliament, never empowered by Henry's break from Rome, stays weak and infrequently summoned. The entire chain of upheavals that shaped modern Britain simply never occurs. There is no Puritan Revolution, no Cromwellian Republic, no Glorious Revolution, and no constitutional monarchy born from the ashes of civil war. England moves forward as a traditional Catholic monarchy, more similar to Spain or Austria than the England we know. Culturally, the country develops along different lines. Without Elizabeth's patronage, Shakespeare's fame may dim or shift toward more continental influences. The English language absorbs even more Latin, shaped by clerical scholarship and Catholic liturgy. Architecture remains proudly Gothic, echoing medieval traditions instead of adopting the Renaissance Protestant aesthetic that reshaped real English cities. This England is not isolationist, but it is slower, steadier, and far more Catholic, shaping a world where the familiar landmarks of British history fade into an entirely different global order. One decision, simple in appearance, monumental in consequence, reshaped the course of English and global history. By remaining loyal to Rome, Henry VIII preserves his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, secures a male heir, and keeps the monarchy tightly aligned with the Catholic Church. The succession stabilizes, and Boleyn never ascends to the throne, Elizabeth I never rules, and England's identity, religious, cultural, and political, remains firmly continental rather than imperial. A single choice alters centuries of dynastic struggles, wars, and cultural revolutions. Contrast this Catholic England with the one we know. In real history, England became Protestant, built a powerful navy, expanded an overseas empire, and evolved parliamentary institutions that shaped modern democracy. The nation surged into global dominance, producing the golden age of Elizabeth, Shakespeare, naval heroes, and early colonial settlements. In the alternate timeline, England remains conservative, deeply Catholic, and closely tied to the papacy. Its monarchy is strong but centralized, its culture slower to innovate, its empire delayed or diminished. The currents of modernity flow elsewhere, leaving England more stable but far less transformative. History changed because a king demanded a divorce. But if Henry VIII had stayed Catholic, the world we know, the empire, the culture, the faith, might never have existed. The English Renaissance would have been smaller, exploration slower, and the rise of Protestantism curtailed. Elizabeth's absence removes the spark that made England extraordinary, leaving a kingdom powerful in tradition but limited in ambition. So I ask you, if England had remained Catholic, who would have been the greatest Tudor? And could the nation have ever risen to global power without Elizabeth I at its helm? The answers may forever belong to a world that almost was.